Recording. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to The Game Master Librarian, Part 1, how you and your library can be a portal for TTRPG learning experiences, with Adam Watson, the Deeper Learning Design Specialist at the Ohio Valley Educational Cooperative. This webinar is being co-sponsored by the American Library Association's Games and Gaming Roundtable. My name is George Bergstrom, and I'm the Southwest Regional Coordinator for the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. I'll be the question moderator for today. I'd like to start off the webinar with a few quick announcements. To register for other webinars or other trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library. This session is 1 hour, so you'll get 1 LEU for today. If you're watching the archived recording of this webinar, the instructions on how to obtain your LEU are available in the video's description on YouTube. Or you can also find those instructions on the Indiana State Library's continuing education site under the LEU policies. I'll now turn it over to Adam.
Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining today. I am very excited, honored, and humbled to be asked to come and speak to you from Indiana and beyond. As the slide on the screen says, this is honoring you as masters of many domains, but of the Game Master Librarian is what we're calling it, as part 1 of a 2-part series. And we're going to concentrate on how you and your library can be a portal for these learning experiences because, spoiler alert, I'm a big believer in the fact that tabletop role-playing games can absolutely enhance an educator-learner experience. And you'll see a couple of social media handles, and those are available in different things, X, Instagram, and so on. So if you are a person with some of those social media platforms and accounts, then by all means, you can follow along to those accounts if you like. All right, and with that, we'll get started. First click. Make sure. Good. All right. I like to ground a little bit. I know that we're in a virtual space and we're in some senses going to be talking about fantastical lands, but I want to honor a little bit as far as the people that had the land that came before. I am located inside of Louisville, Kentucky, is where I am doing this particular podcast webinar from. And in that area, we have many different tribes that have come through our areas who have lived here, who have called this their home, their ancestral land, Osage, Shawnee, Hopewell, and others. So I want to acknowledge that and just honor that before we begin today's webinar. So it is important to say this at the very beginning. Yes, you will absolutely be getting this slide deck at the very end. There will be a bit.ly shortcut provided. We may be able to throw that in the chat notes as well, and probably in the information that'll be sent out after this webinar is complete. But that slide deck will be available for you, and it's really important. I will highlight that sometimes, and sometimes I may not say that out loud. But most of the pictures inside of this slide deck are clickable. And that means that you're going to have goodies to come, article that's linked to it, and so on. And there's also sometimes things in the speaker notes as well. So once you get the slide deck, fully explore. As far as taking notes, it just might be, ooh, I've got to check out that slide, whatever, once I get the slide deck afterwards. So, but beyond that, you will be getting all of them. So just be aware of that. All right, so our driving question of the day for our particular webinar is, how can I integrate tabletop role-playing games to transform learning? There's kind of a bracket or a parenthetical that's implied there that could be integrating tabletop role-playing games in a library. It could be in a classroom setting. I know that many of you, whether they come to your library, you go out into another space, lead classes at all different levels and grade levels and content forms. But I also want to recognize that as a librarian, and this should just be said out loud for the sake of making it loud and clear, I really believe how much you are educators and how much you are important leaders. You are leaders in the sense that you're a hub of learning and resources. And of course, the library is a wonderful, fantastic, unique space that can be a hub in a physical sense for people to come to you, students and teachers. So in a sense, there's a recognition of that and some of the information today and some of the information that perhaps, hopefully, you will find useful and be able to share with your particular friends and colleagues, perhaps in your buildings. and different ways, which again, I know is everything from perhaps school librarians possibly, but also public librarians and university librarians. So I tried very hard to make sure this driving question applied to all those different kind of educator aspects that are out there, hopefully listening and participating today. So very quickly about me, I've been in education since 2005. I'm a former classroom teacher, high school English teacher. Currently in my role with this educational cooperative, even though it's called Ohio Valley, it's technically the part of Kentucky that includes the county of Louisville, Jefferson County, and counties around it. So that current title is a deeper learning design specialist. I write, I blog. EdTech's Elixirs is out there, a Google away if you're curious and interested. Love Star Wars comics, lots of pop culture, obviously, tabletop role-playing games. And I do have a website that, again, once you get the slide deck, you can click for some more information. So this picture is a good encapsulation of me as an introduction to this slide deck and this webinar today. I am a person that was born in the 70s. And actually, here's a fun fact. I was born in 1974, just a month after Dungeons and Dragons launched into the world. So Dungeons and Dragons and myself, we are both 50 years old. So in the 80s is really where I came to be as far as in the world of tabletop role-playing games, and played a lot. Loved them. Many of which somehow made it and managed to live with me all these years later. This bin that you're seeing is an actual white plastic bin full of tabletop role-playing games, many of which go back to the mid-1980s. So my wife is very happy and excited to see this bin travel around. But it's things like this that prove, see, I knew that these things would come in valuable, this information would come in valuable. That's why I'm talking to you today. So just want to show my bona fides as far as, yes, I'm a real old school role-playing game player from back in the day. One of the things that as I became an educator, even though I'd been a while since I'd actually played a role-playing game, many of those things, as you just saw, literally and figuratively went into a bin as I got older, got harder to find players and so on. But I always thought about those tabletop role-playing games, how much fun they were, how engaged I was, how much it helped my imagination and creativity. And one of the things as I came into my educational career a few years in, that I found out about was something called Kentucky Go Play, KY Go Play. It's a hashtag, but it's also a website and a social media handle. And it was kind of like finding like-minded spirits. James Allen and Heidi Neltner were the two individuals that began this in Kentucky. And really, it was just embracing the idea of play, how important that is. And that's not just something like an extra or just a recess. And so it made me feel like that work is honored and that there's a place for it. So that got the brain started, you might say. A few years later, I came across a teacher. This is at this point, I was in a district role for a public school district. And I came across a teacher that was using something called Classcraft, which is kind of like a positive behavior intervention system slash learning management system with his students. And that made me intrigued because there was a lot of fantasy theming that kind of echoed some of those tabletop role-playing games from back in the past. So it gave me a chance to be like, well, what's out there? And from that, in 2017, I wrote this blog entry for that. And this may be the first real attempt publicly that I was like putting out there that maybe there's something about those tabletop role-playing games we can bring into education, into the classroom. So some years go down, and finally I was at a point where, you know what, I was looking and sometimes coming across those different resources and articles and places that talked about the value of those kind of games in an educational environment. And there was kind of a feeling of maybe if you build it, they will come, or a little bit of be the change you want to see, or think globally, act locally. Maybe a combination of one of those things. But the reality is that, well, if nothing else for myself, I would love to put a place where these kind of resources, articles, and examples of teachers doing the things could live. And also, it's a little bit of frankly, an act of faith. I had heard of and talked to a few teachers in Kentucky, and to me, that became kind of the proof of concept. If I can find bluegrass teachers in the state of Kentucky that are doing this work and doing it in ways that are really interesting and impact education and learning, if I can find that in Kentucky and prove that as a point, then it's just almost a given. If I can find, for my Kentucky friends that I help and serve and work with and coach and consult, if they can find people just down the hallway, or at least the highway, that does this kind of work, then it must have something to it. It's not just something that happens far out or on the east or west coast, but something that happens right down the street. So with that, I created this website about a year, well, almost going to become 2 years ago this August, and launched it. It's a hashtag, it's a website. As you can see, there's some social media, different platforms that it's on. And I'll very, very briefly, I'm going to exit out of slide deck mode here and show you the website. Here it is as far as this landing page. The big thing is the resource page. And as you can see, there's lots of different articles, links to different, some white papers, in a few instances, some books that have come out on the subject. You have some embedded videos here of various examples and resources and help. Then you get to the teaching resources themselves, and this is where you're actually finding teachers or people doing the things in classrooms and in schools. And then last but not least, more teaching resources that go along those lines, everything from website tools to products that are out there, games that are out there, and so on. Last but not least, there's this press room, and this is just where there are some examples of me or other people talking about KY Ed RPG and those values of the resources of tabletop role-playing games. So that is the website, and kyedrpg.com is how you get there. Moving past that, I really want to concentrate today on setting you up on some of those resources and answering some of the questions that you or some of your colleagues might have when the idea of tabletop role-playing games in a learning setting come up. So we're going to call this the opening your starter set, the core set of a game called Dragonbane, which is one of my new favorite role-playing games, by the way. I do want to highlight these little standees, these little miniature flat things. That's actually going to come back into play a little bit later. But anyway, so we're going to open our starter set. Let's look at some of the basics. So the first thing is that you have a character sheet. This character sheet is something that you had available when you did the registration. Actually, if possible, if you have not, or if you just came really late to this or just frankly didn't have a chance, I want you to have an opportunity to complete the first beginning part of this role sheet here, character sheet, which is your name, answering on a scale of 1 to 5 these 3 prompt questions. There's a little starting equipment. I'm very asset mindset. What do you already know in this area of games, tabletop role-playing games and education? So maybe some questions of what you want to know to help drive your participation today as you're listening to us. So I want to give a minute, which is either to find yours, or just bring it up on a tab so it's close by, because we're going to return back to this at the end, or give you at least a minute to actually give a good stab at it and complete it before we move on. So with that said, George, do you happen to have the link to that? If not, I can throw that in the chat real quick. I'm going to...
I had it just a minute ago. Let me see if I can grab it for you.
We'll see. It's going to be a race. Let's see who has it first. Copy.
Yeah,
I might win. I might win.
Yeah, probably you.
Okay. I just put it in chat, so you can make a copy of it once you open it up in your Google Drive if you want there. All right. All right. So I'm going to go back into slideshow mode. Okay. I'm going to start that timer just for fun there, just to honor the fact that I want to give you that minute to either bring it up, or if it's due to you, to give you a chance to fill it out. So I'm going to mute myself and be back in a minute. If anyone has any burning questions, this might be a chance to jump in and ask. All right, coming back. Let's see here. So the question for Angelina was trying to start an RPG circulating collection, have it nonfiction. Wonder if it's better to separate that and shelving with the regular board games. I would not pretend to be a librarian expert about that, but I like the idea of, putting them alongside other games and people recognizing that's a game thing. And it looks like Amanda also recognizes and calls it a special collection. I like that phrase as well. So yeah, okay, excellent, excellent. Thank you, friends, for chiming in. We're all learning together, so I appreciate that. All right. Moving on, now that you've got your questions in mind and some of your assets in place, and you've kind of scored yourself, where are you at as far as foundationally? And we'll return to that and see if maybe you've improved and have ability to level up. I want to talk really quick about gamification versus game-based learning. For some of you, this is old hat. For others, this might be a thing that's a point of confusion, or for colleagues, it's hard to articulate. What's the difference? Is there a difference? There's an article link that this is this particular graphic you can click and get to, and it's also in the speaker notes for later. But just to highlight, here's where I say it comes down to. Gamification is what I would call the icing. Okay, it's elements of gaming, but it's not playing an actual game. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not judging that gamification is bad. Please hear me out. So these are not good, bad terms, hierarchy, or judgments. But again, gamification is the icing. If gamification is the icing, then we can call game-based learning the actual cake, right? You learn by playing the game itself. And for those that are familiar with project-based learning, I think the analogy is really good here that fits. So a project is often that dessert is at the end of a unit, but that means that if you ran out of time, you did all the important basic stuff, it's okay. Versus project-based learning, which the project itself and doing that project over the course of a couple of 3 weeks, perhaps, that is where the learning happens throughout that process with a public culmination, right? So I think gamification versus game-based learning kind of works in a similar way. For those that are perhaps hung up or trying to find ways to articulate to friends, well, what's the difference? I mean, how is a board game different than a role-playing game versus a tabletop role-playing game? Well, role-playing games in general are participatory, cooperative, and a co-created story. You find some of those things in contrast with many board games, not necessarily all. I often throw up Monopoly just as an example of that, right? So Monopoly is competitive. You take on a token, which is a little bit different than playing a role or taking on a character. Like I might be the dog, but that doesn't mean that I am a dog or that I bark when I talk or I get into the method acting of it, right? It's just a token that represents me as I go so many spaces around a board. In Monopoly, there are wins and losses in terms of money in this case, as far as the metric. But you can't really say that there's a story or a narrative, and it's certainly not a story that you can necessarily co-create with the people around the board. These are all opposite of what we might call a role-playing game, where there's usually a character, it's more immersive. And for most role-playing games, it's the idea of we're working together to achieve a common goal. And we really are creating the story together, which is a very unique aspect. So a tabletop role-playing game is usually all of those things, but we just add some texture to it, usually maps, miniatures, and of course, the all-famous dice. Because the key thing in tabletop role-playing games, maybe one of the discerning characteristics, is the idea that there's an element of chance and luck based on the roll of a dice. However, that's augmented by my abilities and skills. If I'm particularly have good dexterity, then I'm a little bit more capable of jumping that chasm, for example, than another person who may have less dexterity. So that will influence in a positive way my role for success. So what's this look like in a classroom setting? And I think that's important to establish because it's a little bit more unique feeling and sounding. There is definitely in a library setting, what we certainly see as an extracurricular club. And it's a great entry point as far as tabletop role-playing games. But I'd love for the opportunity while we're here to kind of see that there is an opportunity to go deeper and actually go into an instructional method and mode. So this was actually a segment on something called KT Kentucky Edition. This is our local Kentucky PBS station. They did a segment on what this would feel like in a classroom setting. Justin Gadd is a Shelby County Public School teacher. And so I'm going to attempt, this is the only video I want to play, but this is how much I think the video is useful for kind of setting that stage. And so I'm going to try to play it now. We should have all the things tested that this will work delightfully. But George, be prepared to scream if this does not play or come across or stutters too bad. So friends, here we go.
For years, Dungeons and Dragons has been played in the home. Now it's making its way into the classroom. Educators around the country are using role-playing games and making learning fun. We went to Shelby County to learn more about role-playing games and how they help kids learn.
When it comes to game-based learning, the idea of it is that the game is how you learn. It's the process upon which you as a student learn the content or learn the skills. And in that sense, role-playing games, especially tabletop role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons, can be a really powerful way of achieving both the academic and also that social emotional component.
You got to be a critical thinker, you have to be an effective communicator, you have to be a responsible collaborator working with teams. There's math, there's creative writing, there's all kinds of skills that students can use.
These ideas of critical thinker, productive collaborator, effective communicator are exactly along the lines of things that the state of Kentucky has started to craft called the Portrait of a Learner. And it's something that many districts now throughout the state of Kentucky are also doing in their own Portrait of a Learner or Profile of a Graduate for their different districts.
Isn't it a little bit early for these kind of hijinks?
I used to not be that very imaginative and creative, but like just going into D&D, that's helped me expanded my like outlines of what makes a good story and whatnot. And so when I'm like in ELA, I can usually write better.
I love to use them in the classroom. You could use it in English language arts with creative writing. You could use it in math with learning statistics and probability. One of my buddies, Patrick Lamar, he created a Dungeons and Dragons style game with the Oregon Trail. And so students had to use a D20 dice, and they had different classes like blacksmith with their different skills. And as they encountered problems, they had to roll a dice to see how successful they were at surviving the Oregon Trail. So I kind of took his idea and turned it into ancient history with life as a Roman soldier. And some of these students were like really blown away by how some of them didn't survive, some of them barely made it, and they're like, did Roman soldiers really have to deal with this?
When you have something like a role-playing game, the story is alive. You are part of that story. That changes the whole idea of what history feels like, or science. Instead of reading a book, you're a character in the book. It's all of those opportunities to bring in a student into the experience, to create a deeper learning experience for them.
You are going on a boat.
Something about imagination and creativity was just like really fun to me.
Gamifying learning makes it so much more engaging. And I had students who came to me saying, this is the one time every week that I know I'm gonna smile and have fun. That stuff does make a difference in how you learn. I think anything that gets a kid excited to go to school is important because we need that.
True story. To learn more about how role-playing games can be used in the classroom, visit kyedrpg.com.
All right. So, real quick, George, if you wanted to do a quick perusal, was there any burning questions before we move on? This might be another chance to catch some.
Yeah, I think you've gotten the ones that came through.
Okay, excellent.
Got a lot
And
of
of course,
positive comments.
Oh, well, there's that. And keep talking amongst yourselves. You're probably going to be answering your own questions and sharing your expertise as well in the background, which I love. Continuing on. So we had this story of that, and that video, of course, is a clickable once you get the slide deck. Let's talk about beginning your campaign. Of course, the campaign is something you hear about in role-playing games, which is an ongoing series of adventures with the same group of characters, certainly at least the same group of players, even if the characters slightly change. And so that's what we're about to journey on. So really, this is the big, to me, the million-dollar question. When someone wants to bring something like a tabletop role-playing game into a learning institution, public library, school library, a school, a classroom, and that's, our tabletop role-playing games educational? And that's fair. We have to honor that as a fair question. I might think of it as obvious, but I'm biased, right? So I want to arm you, if you will, you can use that metaphorically or literally, with some things that you can think or bring back when someone asks that question. The colleague who's like, I'm thinking about doing it my place, my classroom, my whatever, but is this good? Or maybe your boss who's like, calm down a little bit. I'm not sure if that's going to work in our institution, our library, or whatnot. Well, let's look at it from a couple of different areas. We'll be brief on this. And again, you can delve further later, but we'll think about it from the academic perspective, the social emotional learning perspective, and the durable skills perspective. Certainly, Justin Gadd spoke about that a little bit to Shelby County's profile of a graduate and how he believed that his extracurricular club and his opportunity to use it in actual classroom lessons, it was like an easy duh. Yes, this is perfect. This is awesome. This is exactly. So we'll tackle that as well. All right. So first off, if that means anything to you, the International Literacy Association, the ILA, actually did a webinar series about a year ago on the idea of how can role-playing games, or specifically Dungeons and Dragons, but you could apply that in a general sense, how does it help reading? How does it help literacy? We won't play these clips, but I do want to just show and share the fact that on the left, you have Cade Wells, who's a middle school teacher in South Dakota, and he speaks very eloquently about, I have data when these students in my classroom who are heavily involved in Dungeons and Dragons on a weekly level, he's full in. His map scores were much higher than his colleagues. And so if you want data, there's data. On the right, you have Emily Rayner, who's from Canada. She talks about how these students that were upper elementary, for our school system would be considered upper elementary, were so eager in the gaming and the playing. One of the best stories she had is that there was a group of students that grabbed the monster manual and said, Miss Emily, we're going to cheat. We're going to read about the monsters so that when we come across them in the next thing, we'll know what to do. And she's like, yes, read this high level text. You go right ahead and cheat, right? So, it's just great stories in general is just, yes, it absolutely has an impact on literacy and reading. So as far as numeracy and science ideas, to be fair, you see a lot of humanities leveling and overlapping as far as opportunities with tabletop role-playing games, but there's some in the math and the science as well. Dice have been great math manipulatives, right? Those are like almost traditional for a long, long time. So we just want to acknowledge that the dice themselves physically can be helpful. You can make the math equations to solve, skin it, if you will, put it in the concept or context of riddles, right? So it may just sound like it's a narrative or it's a branding kind of situation, but it may not take much as far as elevation to make those math lessons suddenly come more alive in the narrative of it's a riddle to solve, not an equation to solve, right? Wizards could be alchemists that need to know their periodic table well. And so the way a spell is going to work or not is how these interactions are, put the right elements together kind of thing. That could be a concept. Certainly STEM, STEAM, and makerspace machinery. And I'm thinking of librarian friends that have this kind of equipment. These also could be aspects where perhaps if it's a game that you're making, maybe as part of a project-based learning activity, for example, they need to make game pieces. Those makerspace materials might come in very, very handy. And last but not least, NASA. Yes, NASA. The National Aeronautics Space Association agency. They recently, just in the last couple of months, came up with their own role-playing game adventure, which is system agnostic. You come to it with your favorite fantasy role-playing game system, perhaps. But they have actually adventure with hardcore science like astronomy. This is not easy stuff, but they put it in the context of a role-playing game adventure. So that's clickable for finding out more information about that and downloading the actual adventure itself. So it's out there. You can find some math and science for sure. If we're thinking about social emotional learning, there was a white paper done at the beginning, actually a little more than a year ago, I think now. But the idea of it is that Foundry 10 was an organization that got together with a therapeutic role-playing game counseling group. They actually use tabletop role-playing games as a counseling tool with people that are needing therapy. So it's a therapeutic device. And they did a white paper after doing some research. And this is a pull-out quote from that white paper. It's clickable so you can see the rest of it if you want later. But I'm just going to go quiet for a minute and let you read that, and then we'll move on. All right. And as we move on, I just want to highlight those words. Some of those that are jumping out, you could argue are social emotional learning, but are also good things we may call those durable skills like collaboration, problem solving, conflict resolution. And on that note, I bring up the Kentucky Portrait of a Learner. This is something that statewide was given relatively recently as an attempt to inspire the districts that are in Kentucky that still have not done their own portrait of a learner or profile of a graduate for their own district. This is what it might look like, and these are what the competencies might feel like for your own district, for your own school situation system. Most of these words are fairly evident, but I will say that the one I was really excited about to read when they came out and released this is the one for creative contributor. Because for creative contributor, it says interprets experiences, imagines, and plays with new possibilities with curiosity, creates approaches that are novel. Whew. Like, thank you, Kentucky Portrait of a Learner, because you just done the work for me. You have just basically said tabletop role-playing games, ding, ding, ding. I mean, these are the things that, and you could argue many of the other areas as well, but here's really the heart of what's awesome about tabletop role-playing games in an educational learning setting. So we talked just in general. We've kind of established that skeptic, the person that says, are tabletop role-playing games educational? But let's move into some specifics as far as you as a librarian, with you with a library. How are things that we could share that might help you fight the good fight, right? So let's pull those people in. First off, I won't play the clip, but this official Dungeons and Dragons clip is a great example of what are the benefits of an extracurricular D&D club. D&D has made it easy for you with this just under 3-minute clip. Very well produced and done, to talk about the power of that and seeing how exciting, joyful these kids are for launching a club. So if you're having to convince a person, convince your boss, let me do this thing, this clip might be part of that process for you. Some text resources. On the far left, again, these are all clickable, as most of these things are. On the far left, you have a blog entry that I did where I talked to Justin Gadd, our friend from the Kentucky Tonight news segment. And he had a very interesting story in the sense that he did start off as an extracurricular club, but he did it during the pandemic. And it certainly had its challenges, but he has some wonderful anecdotes about how it was really a game changer, pardon the pun, for his students that, as all of us, were really struggling for connection. We're feeling isolated and alone, trying to find some joy in a dark time, to put it lightly. And the power of that. And really, it's an inspirational story of, if he could pull it off in a virtual setting during a pandemic, think of all the benefits and the ease of logistics if we could do it in person, right? So a recommended read. The middle book was only, again, fairly recent, maybe published in the last year or two. Lucas Maxwell is actually a British librarian, but he addresses that question of running that successful program. And if you didn't know he was British, the way he's spelling program gives it away. So in some ways, it's kind of unique. It's certainly with British euphemisms. British just focuses on what a school library would be for them. He also has an interesting story because he identifies as autistic. So he talks about neurodiversity and the importance of how role-playing games has helped him personally, but also the people he's had in different clubs and so on. And of course, he shares other people's stories as well. It's a very short read. It's barely 100 pages, but it's a good librarian to librarian opportunity for you to hear that story. And last but not least, most of you here are probably aware of that, but Game RT is a subgroup inside of the American Library Association. I really love this particular article by Jake Ciarapeka. I'm so sorry, Jake, if you're ever listening or ever watch this. I know I just did a horrible thing with your last name, but you had a great article. That's why I wanted to share it with you all about, some of the successes. And I'll just pull one big tip. He recognizes that when you have something like an extracurricular club, like in a library setting, the reality is people come and go. You're going to have probably in any given Tuesday that you have the club, someone that's never played the game before, never been to the club walk in, and then you have the two friends that have been there every week for 3 weeks. They've had a sport or some other activity and they couldn't be there, and there's that floating in and out. So how do you embrace that? Lean into that, because it could be frustrating, of course, when you're trying to set up a consistency or adventure, or what does it mean when these two people that play two characters suddenly aren't there? He has some great tips and strategy to go with that. So some resources for you all. If you're not aware, Dungeons and Dragons over the last few years have come out with this Young Adventurer's Guide D&D series. I don't have to tell any librarian worth their salt in this room that the fantasy novel is rich and the genre has many different opportunities for exploration and reading. But I did want to point out these kind of have that, serve a good in-between. In other words, they're an opportunity for literacy and reading and all of that, but it does kind of ease you into a world of something like a Dungeons and Dragons. And for some people, that might be their entry in. Like once they read about the places and portals, the different places that could show up in Dungeons and Dragons campaign, they may be more likely or feel more comfortable or confident to join an actual game. use whatever entry points you can, friends. This is maybe perhaps one of them as far as an opportunity. This is big. Again, Dungeons and Dragons, there are so many other tabletop role-playing games. I never want to feel like Dungeons and Dragons are the only one, but Friends is also the one that probably people, it's just like when people say Kleenex, they really mean tissue paper, you know, but that's facial tissue. They always say Kleenex, that's a Coke, you know, is a Coke, right? Even though it's really soda pop. So same idea with Dungeons and Dragons. It has the name recognition. Dungeons and Dragons does have a D&D after school club kit that you can apply for and get for free. And you can see here on the screen on the slide deck, all these free physical things that you could receive and have shipped to you. Of course, quantities are limited, you know, don't hesitate, join now. You know, this time of the year, you maybe want to start plotting and thinking about doing it in the summer to prepare for the fall. But it is an opportunity and is possibly free materials that you as a librarian of a educational institution might have the ability to get. So when I prove there's a page, but again, all this is clickable as far as getting to the right place on the Dungeons and Dragons website. I recognize two things that are true, that you have a limited budget sometimes, you don't have all the money in the world, and also that you may have limited space, because where are you going to put all the things? The rule books, box sets of different role-playing games, that may not be too bad. But as you start getting into the maps and miniatures and stuff like that, it can get sprawling really quick. So here's some heads up of some things to think about. First off, the first image here on the left, far left, is Loki battle mats. And what's great about them is that they are spiral bound, but they open up, as you can see from this example. So there's a left and right side that becomes a fuller, bigger map. These materials are awesome because they're dry and wet erasable as far as markers that you can put on them. You can put different decal kind of things, which they also sell. So you can set up a tree or a terrain or whatever the case may be. And it already has the grids on them that are famous in these role-playing games, these 1-inch squares that are the typical scale size for miniatures. So it's great. You open it up. There's a bunch of different terrains in one particular map, or one particular book, for example. But when you're done, at the end of the day, fold it up, put it on the shelf. So, and if you consider the replayability of just even one of these books, it's probably a good kind of purchase when you're budget conscious. The middle and the right side show these small acrylic flat miniatures. The middle one's called Arc Knight, and the ones on the right are called Skinny Minis, which is a clever name. The idea of this is that when you think of miniatures that are 3D, you can imagine how much space that could take if you want to protect them from getting broke, especially. And B, they're expensive. Even if you buy them unpainted and keep them that way, they would add up in terms of cost, right? However, there are these packs of these flat miniatures that come with stands that could be much easier to store and frankly, give you a little more bang for the buck as far as for the cost when you're making the purchase in the budget. So I don't get $1 of endorsement for any of these things you purchase, of course. I have to make that clear, but hopefully these are ideas and tools for trying to be budget conscious and trying to be space conscious. Okay, I have to just give love out loud to these friends. One who's a librarian, the other one's a social studies teacher, both from a high school in Washington, Illinois, which is near Peoria, I believe. And they run a podcast called Teachers in the Dungeon. Been doing it for a few years. They are fantastic. Highly recommend listening and subscribing. But I highlight them on this slide because when I first found out about them, really just kind of stumbling upon their podcast, they have done for 2 years now and about to do year number 3, a role-playing game summer camp. Now, as librarians of any ilk, public, university, school, think about the opportunities for this. You know, you're outside of the school year, right? You're in the summer. These gentlemen do this for a 4-day program. Even if you do it for a day or two, or as a starting point for a day or two, it might be still a great idea. Kids in their particular role-playing game summer camp, and this high school students, have opportunities to have sessions where they learn what's it like to map or what's it like to create a backstory for a character, which really are carryover skills academically. And what happens is they have playing time in the afternoon. So it's like they learn some stuff in the morning, and the afternoon they play a little bit of adventure of a campaign. Next morning, same idea. The adventure continues that afternoon and so on. And it's just an opportunity for them to have that. And what really particularly inspired them to do it is they recognize as their game clubs grew, they needed student DMs. There just wasn't enough adults. This is a way of really training ground for them. So people come out of this camp, a half dozen students who can run 4 or 5 students of their own. And there's a lot of success in it. Now, over the last several years, Tom, who is the librarian of the bunch, Tom Gross, has like a game club that's like 70 plus students. But again, couldn't manage it if it wasn't for these student DMs making it possible. So there's some clickables. This one on the lower left has a recent podcast where students shared their voice of how the Dungeons and Dragons really, and student DMing in particular, has really changed their life for the better. So highly recommend checking out those friends. Think about a one-shot open house. For a public library, it might be an open house of come and see our facilities, right? For a school, it might be there's a mock schedule going on, but for those couple of hours, people can come in and learn some things about the adventure extracurricular club, gaming club opportunities. Just really quickly burning through this opportunities here. Get some Halloween decor, but wait after like November 1st, because that's where all that material is super cheap. So you get a lot of stuff that's on sale. Maybe have some videos playing, especially finding things on YouTube where students or kids are playing these games, because there's the proof right there on the flat panel TV that's over there in the corner of what's it like and how is it possible for kids to play these role-playing games. Find maybe some looping sounds. There's lots of acoustical ambiance kind of websites out there for free. There's 2 with links there. There's lots of opportunities for bringing in smells. There's all the senses. There's 5 of them, right? We covered the seeing, we've covered the listening, but let's talk about scent. Don't do candles. Those are dangerous, but there are now melted wax cubes that have sense of like a dank dungeon or a mummy's tomb or an enchanted forest and all the flavors that you can think of. It's a great opportunity to create yet another immersive opportunity inside of a space, and this would be a good opportunity to play that out. There are cookbooks for tabletop role-playing games. A couple of them are clickable there once you get the slide deck. Not only could you have them in your library, of course, because people could check them out and have fun making recipes that are tabletop role-playing, fantasy role-playing game themed, but make some. And there's an opportunity for people to enjoy that in the library. Just don't spill. Your carpets cannot stand spills, so make sure that they're very careful when they eat. And last but not least, some giant foam dice might be fun. People could roll, and the number gives them, for instance, a book recommendation. If they roll a natural 20, perhaps they get a prize out of a chest that's actually decorated like a mimic, which is a Dungeons and Dragons monster, by the way. It imitates other things like a treasure chest, but really has a big giant tongue and teeth, and it eats you. Anyway, that could be a fun thing to kind of continue that theming idea for your open house opportunity. I want to briefly go into some classroom ideas, because I recognize that, again, if you're not actually holding a classroom of students in a way yourself, you're going to have friends and colleagues that are interested or looking for resources. So I want to briefly go through that. The first thing I want to do is to give you a framework, because I think this is important and very useful, because when you think about tabletop role-playing games, it's huge. How am I going to get started, right? Especially if I've never really played games like this before. So this framework, I think, gives you some language that might help with that. So we start with adjacent. So the idea of adjacent is just that extracurricular club opportunity. And whoops, did not mean to open that. Okay, and that wasn't working either. Okay, there we go. Okay, so it's the idea of the extracurricular club, but it's not happening inside of a classroom environment or a lesson environment. Okay, the next idea is really inside of a classroom, inside of a scheduled periodic time itself, depending on your grade level, of course, whether we're talking periods and bells or something like an elementary school. So first we talk elemental. It's just using certain aspects of tabletop role-playing games. You're not trying to find the time or the skill set to run an entire game, but an aspect of it that you think you can use to impact learning. We'll talk about character sheet activity in just a bit. Another level up from that, perhaps, is an episodic. You're actually playing a game, right? Where elemental doesn't require a game. Episodic is we're playing a game. We're in an immersion. We're in a simulation. May just be for a couple of 3 days. That's cool. And maybe it's a one and done. But it's truly playing a tabletop role-playing game. And we're going to hear more about, we heard about Patrick Lamar briefly when Justin Gay was talking in the news segment. We'll come back to that. And last but not least is the full enchilada, right? Like an entire course or several units, maybe even a school system of a school is built around the concept of tabletop role-playing games. We're going to talk about that for like 5 seconds today, but I do want to point out that they exist. Like there are even schools that use those elements. Probably not for the faint of heart, and probably not something you're going to start tomorrow. But again, this framework just gives you where in the pool are you going to wade in? What way are you going to dip your toe into the idea of tabletop role-playing games? So the next idea that you have to kind of tackle is the game mastering problem, right? Like when you have a tabletop role-playing game, you also often have a game master, dungeon master in D&D who kind of runs adventure, referees the rules. Well, in typical class setting, if you're one adult, 30 students, But even if you're in a library setting where it's you and 8, 10, 15 people, like, what are you going to do? So this, again, gives you an idea as a framework. The first one is that none, because no actual game is played. So you solve the problem by not worrying about it, like this character sheet activity that we're going to discuss. Auto GM is an idea that there's a railroad story that somehow has a system that self-guides things. Patrick Lamar uses a Google slide deck to run the kids through an encounter. So you could do it in small groups in his classroom. But there's also websites that have that branching narrative idea, like Mission US is an example of that, where you're making choices and you're enacting a particular role as a character, but the system, in kind of a video gamey style, does that for you, right? So it alleviates the problem of who's the adult that has to do it. But last but not least, there is the idea of, you know, a student GM or a teacher GM making that happen too. And again, going back to the example of our friends, teachers in the dungeon who do the role-playing game summer camp to help create those student DMs, okay? Some other classroom examples. David Bennett is an elementary friend. He has what we'd call an adjacent example because it's outside of a school instruction, but he does it during recess with fifth graders in a 30-minute time setting. Now you talk about the time constraints of that, right? Or the general constraints. It's elementary, it's only 30 minutes. And yet he had some success doing that with a group of students. He did it with a simplified role-playing game system. You see Pathfinder Savage Worlds there highlighted. But still, and that helped make the gameplay faster, which when you only have 30 minutes, that's super important. But again, don't look at restrictions. There's all sorts of possibilities, even if the time or other constraints are there. Another friend, Chad Collins, who also with teachers Michelle Gross and Sarah Parnell at a middle school, did what you might call an elemental opportunity. He used the idea of classes and connected them to different academic areas, like a ranger, a beastmaster was language arts, for example. And he constructed this as a way of students to personalize their path of learning in this elective course that he has for an academic team, which has grown to have members that aren't even a member of the active team, of the academic team. But he used those ideas of role-playing games, students' grades. They didn't earn grades, they earned experience points, you know. Some great opportunities there to use that language, the elements of role-playing games to impact learning in a positive way. And I love the lower right. That's actually in this display case right outside his classroom, because one of the things the students do is they do some review games. There's a first, second, and third place in the leaderboard, and they actually roll for prizes. They get some treasure cards. They actually roll D20 dice. I mean, when I saw this happen live, my heart was afire. It was awesome. Okay, character sheets. Mary Rowe is a parochial middle school teacher that shared this activity with me. She took the Dungeons and Dragons character sheet, and when they were doing the Age of Exploration, also a middle school example, and she basically said, hey, take the real life explorer, put them through filling out this character sheet. And the key thing really was, besides just numbers and equipment and things of that nature, it was really just creating an argument, right? Like statistically, here's why I think Cortez is all of these things, or Christopher Columbus is all these things, but why, right? And defending that verbally is and was a key element, I think, as far as the character sheet activity. But again, we're not playing a full game. It's just an element, and all it took was like Dungeons and Dragons sheets that are free downloads. So a character sheet opportunity. The bulletin board idea, though, is that once completed, what a great way to display the work. Just, you know, staple them up on a bulletin board. It could be in your library, it could be outside of a classroom. But the key thing is that they're displayed and probably going to bring in some interest of what's this all about, right, for teachers and students. So we talked about Patrick Lamar and that slide deck. He basically took the ideas of the Oregon Trail and he created a system where students created these characters and then as a group marched through with the slide deck kind of playing the game master of these different events. And they, at that point, had, you know, failure or success. Some didn't make it. The ones that did continued on. He had a great opportunity with that. And it really made that whole, you know, Oregon Trail Manifest Destiny thing come alive. John Brewer, a high school teacher who had a creative writing class, did the full immersion into role-playing games. In this creative writing class, they start by actually rolling up a character. They fill out a character sheet. They make a backstory. And you can probably not have to stretch here much to see how you're using those ELA skills right off the bat. And he can go through the whole thing in standards reference and standards base, how all of this stuff makes these ELA standards come alive, not to mention the SEL, not to mention the durable skills. So the player's handbook sits right beside some really important tomes and thoughts of books as part of his literacy, as part of his class. So good stuff. Not for the faint of heart, for sure. And took him probably a couple of years to kind of tweak it, but he's really got a great system for his creative writing course. Some digital tools. I want to give you some tools. We talking about this auto GM idea. How can we create ways of having students go through this without having a bunch of game masters that you have to come up with? But that's in the passive experience, right? So students just going through the game, not a bad thing, but I want to show that this is actually something you can make as a creative opportunity, not just a consumption opportunity. And that thankfully we have some digital tools to really make this come alive, to make those branching narratives possible. And as a student, as a learner, as a person in your library activity, I can make basically, in effect, a game and then publish it and have students be able to experience the game by going through my branching narrative story. So some of the tools, you could use Google Slides to do this. I have a link here when you click on this particular graphic for Eric Kurtz, who has an article about how that could work. It's not hard. In fact, it's probably the most easy because most of us are familiar with Google Slides. The issue is just that you really have to keep those branching narratives straight. And inside of Google Slides, it's like, you know, keeping from having a dead end. You click here to turn left, but there's no slide there to go with it or whatever. But Google Slides is one tool that you could possibly use. There's another one called Twine. It almost looks and feels like a type of code as far as how you're writing and creating it. But it's a free product, free to use, free to publish. And again, thanks to it, which is a little bit more complicated to use, it kind of keeps those branching narratives a little bit more in track as far as making sure you don't have those dead ends as easily. And last but not least, one that's been around for a while is Inkle Writer, part of Inkle Studios. Again, this one is free to use. It is probably a little bit more graphic friendly and user friendly, but all these different tools have their charm. So again, not just having students go through it as adventurers, but to be the narrator who creates the game is a great opportunity for both them and for the people that experience their story/games. AI, it's a law that's passed. I don't know about all of Indiana or all the states that are on this call, but you know that every webinar has to talk about artificial intelligence for 2.5 minutes. It's the law. I mean, if you don't do it, then they restrict your funding. So duly noted, I've got to do that for the next 2.5 minutes. John Brewer, we talked about him a minute ago as far as his creative writing class. He shared this in a X posting where he was like, hey, thinking about doing a one shot. He gave a prompt just to see what it would say. Hey, ChatGPT or your favorite large language tool, can you make a one-shot D&D campaign based in Great Gatsby? And it said, sure. Why don't you drop them into a party scenario? Socialites, mobsters, they're interacting. You're trying to find Gatsby based on the conversations you have with the NPCs, and they have their own goals. It could be a great, again, a one-shot for a day or two as far as a lesson. And it was really that particular post that really inspired Chad Collins to say, hey, I'm right in the middle of doing a new way of constructing and designing my own course that I'm going to do for the following year. And he shared that AI was helping him come up with scenario and monster descriptions and all sorts of fun stuff as far as with AI. So AI has a place in the story as well. In this book done by Donnie Piercy, who is a Kentucky educator, he talked about 50 strategies for integrating AI into the classroom. He has a whole page of one of his strategies calling Pick Your Own Plot, where he gives suggestions for prompts that could basically set up a student through the AI chat text generator how to do a role-playing game-like experience. And this could be as a group, collectively, you as a teacher being the one to type it, or depending on the age and the maturity, the students themselves could, after they put in the prompt, run it solo. But AI is there, and I think I hit the 2.5 minute mark for that, so I can go on. Some other digital tools we have is a Google Dice Roller. I recognize that for a variety of reasons, cost, students throwing them at each other, I mean, whatever it might be, dice can sometimes add up as a cost or a difficulty in a classroom, easy to lose. So if that's the case, you are literally a Google away from doing it for free and easy. So if you Google Dice Roller, you will come up with all the polyhedral dice examples that are typical of a role-playing game set and roll several of them at the same time. You can add modifiers like pluses and minuses to those rolls, all that within that. And it's not the only kind of dice roll you'll find online, but it is Google and probably one of the quickest to get to. So Google Dice Roller. Dungeon Scroll is another website. And the thing that's really cool about this is that, again, for free, there's a certain limitation for free, but I think you'll get your good use out of it for no charge. You can create dungeon maps. And it's saved within your browser. So that makes it super easy as far as, when you fire up your browser again and it knows it's you, to find previous dungeons you've created to make new ones. So another interesting tool in your toolbox or for your student toolbox as far as creating maps. Gradecraft is a learning management system that's all centered around game-based learning principles. And you can see some of the graphics and little text just from the screenshot that I'm showing you up on the screen, how true that is, of leaning into the idea of the principles of, playing, failing forward and showing progress, the idea of levels and all that fun stuff. There's some limited opportunities, I think, to do it for free. And then there are licenses you could perhaps purchase. But again, if you want something that's just a different or a learning management system that may lean more into these game-based learning kind of principles, this one might be one for you to explore. So we're getting near the end. And in closing, I want to come back to your final reflection of your character tool slide deck. So I want you to take, and I'll start the timer here. I want you to see if you can go back to those 3 scores, score them again near the end of your slide deck. Have you leveled up? Have you increased in one or more of those areas? And tally your treasure. What's maybe some answers you got back to that driving question, or maybe a golden insight, a riddle that was solved? What's the next move on your map? What are some things that out of the information you got today that it's burning in your core that you're thankful that you've answered, or you're thankful you've gotten that insight? And at the bottom line is that you're going to do something. It's always about applying this knowledge in your particular setting and context. So I'll give you another minute and a half. I tell you what, in the chat, for the sake of sharing for friends, I would love to know any of the above. Share an insight, share a next move. Tell me if your knowledge score went from a 2 to a 4 or whatever. If you had any particular jumps up in your ability scores there, share them so we all can celebrate them. So I'll go silent for about a minute.
And while you all are answering your question, I will just let everyone know I did drop the LU request form in the chat. I will do that again right now if you missed it. The recording is, of course, still recording, and I'll be sending that out in a few days. And someone asked in the chat about scraping all the links out of this wonderful conversation that has been going, and I will definitely do that as well. So all of those things will be coming to you.
All right, I'm going to transition out of that. This is certainly a moment for other questions and next steps, but I tell you what I'm going to do. Let me do these 2 things, and I'll come back and we'll finish with answering any questions or Q&A. Do you know that there is a part 2 of this, which is actually a little bit more, now that the foundation's been set, we got some of these basics understood. We're going to have a moment, some moments to be more immersive and to try out some things. And that will be the part 2 of this, which is part of Game RT and ALA. That happens on May 31st. It happens at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And again, in the speaker notes and also on the clickable for this particular graphic, you will get a registration link on how to get to there and do that. And I highly hope and recommend we'll have a good time. I know the guy who's going to run it. That's me. So I tease. So anyway, part 2 is happening on May 31st. And if I know what Indiana is the state that this was focused on, although we have friends all the way to Alaska, but if anyone's going to Gen Con has a wonderful opportunity. It's in Annapolis. On July 31st, they have something called a trade day. And the trade day is focused for educators and game owners and librarians. I think that's literally the three groups that they specifically target or mention. So you show some credentials as an educator, you're able to buy a badge, which is good for the entire conference, by the way, if you want to stay for the full 4 days. But on Wednesday, July 31st, is when they have trade day. Myself and that friend Justin Gadd that you saw in the Kentucky Tonight segment will be doing a session. So 10 a.m. on that Wednesday, there's some information there. We would love to see you there if you're a Gen Con goer. And so with that, burning questions or next steps or anything else that someone wants to share out loud. And George, I know the chat went way beyond me being able to monitor it, but if there's any burning questions, we'll try to tackle.
Yeah, it got really hot here at the end. Let's see, and it keeps scrolling on me, so forgive me here as I try to grab them. What is the danger of AI stealing ideas or concepts from multiple people but presenting as a condensed form? Would that be theft, or would the AI make the game more complicated? And I know we didn't focus on AI, so feel free to.
We briefly talked about it as far as the use. It is a great question, both in ethics and everything else. I will say briefly that even Dungeons and Dragons are wrestling with that because they had an artist that was kind of caught using AI for a particular book. And it was before a policy went into place about what to do about that. I don't have an easy answer for that. I will say that there are certainly ways and tools that if you use it as a partner and a collaborator, that for you as an educator / librarian / game master, I certainly can see the power of that. But there is a point where it gets into some muddy waters quickly as far as, I create to use an image, is that image mine? Did it use into an artist? I definitely would say at the very least be transparent. This was AI generated, and having those talks as far as the ethics of it. That's my 30-second version of an answer to that, but it's a great question. It's just a complicated one. So yeah.
Sure. Oh, I just had one and it moved again. Here we go. Do you have any thoughts on how TTRPG programming can be beneficial for adult patrons in a public library setting?
For adults, I would say that some interesting angles there might be people that are feeling a little lonely and isolated. They need some social opportunities. I've seen in game stores, and I can't see why a library couldn't be in a similar fashion. It could be everything from an opportunity of getting to know you. You could have targets of specific adults, like a 60-year plus group or something, as far as like trying tabletop role-playing games, so that you can find friends and patrons that might, need a little bit of encouragement of coming together and meeting new friends and meeting new people. So that might be some ideas of angles. I'm like, how could we have adult patrons be a part of it? And preteens and teens definitely should have their fun too, but why and how we can get adults in the door doing it as well. One more, maybe?
Yeah, we should. Let me see if I can find one. Obviously, there's lots of thanks and expressions of how they found themselves leveling up.
Good.
Let's see here. Oh, one question, pretty technical, is are the trade day talks available virtually?
Great question. They're not. They're only in person. There's been some times where maybe the keynote or something possibly could be recorded, but in general, the multiple breakout sessions are definitely an in-person only. So for those that live in Indiana, at least, if you're less than 2 hours away, that's at least might be an opportunity. And for those that are farther away, I get that might make it more difficult, but yeah, it's in person. Well, I have up here on the slide the bit.ly and a QR code as far as how to get to today's slide deck, and please fully explore a lot of those clickables as far as articles and links that are in the speaker notes and other places in the images, and explore those resources more deeply. I am so thankful for the opportunity today to be with you. I'm so thankful for you to spend an hour of your time with me speaking about this topic that I'm very passionate about. Please reach out if you have any questions and share your stories. I would love to know the programs you all are doing in your libraries, the opportunities you have to collaborate with others. But bottom line is spreading the joy and the love that really not just makes education and learning more joyful, but life more joyful, I think, for tabletop role-playing games. So all that social media and information up there on the page is a good place for me to stop. And I will, I think, stop sharing at this point. And there we go. So friends, thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to you, George.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.